Ah, welcome. Warm yourself by the fire. Have a seat or snuggle up in your favorite spot and let me tell you a story. The moment we had entered the barn, I regretted the rash good nature which prompted me to consent to the plans of those vivacious young students. Miss Anstill and Miss Royce, and one or two others, often leaders in student mischief, I suspect, were the first to enter, and they amused themselves by hiding in the darkness and greeting the rest of our party as we entered with sundry shrieks and moans, such as are commonly attributed to ghosts. My wife and I brought up the rear, carrying the 2 farm lanterns. She had selected the place for an amused consideration of the question, and I confess I hardly approved of her judgment. But she is native to this part of the country, and she had assured us that there were some vague traditions hanging about the building that made it most suitable for our purposes. It was a musty old place, without even as much tidiness as is usually found in barns, and there was a dank smell about it, as though generations of haystack had decayed there. There were holes in the floor, and in the dusk of early evening, it was necessary for us to pick our way through with the greatest of care. It occurred to me then, in a premonitory way, that if some young woman student sprained her ankle in this absurd environment, I should be most embarrassed to have to explain it. Apparently it was a hay barn, whose vague dimensions were lost in shadow. Rafters crossed its width about 20 feet above our heads, and here and there a few boards lay across the rafters, furnishing foothold for anyone who might wish to operate the ancient pulley that was doubtless once used for lifting bales. The northern half of the floor was covered with hay to a depth of 2 or 3 feet. How long it had actually been there, I cannot imagine. It was extremely dusty, and I feared a recurrence of my old enemy hay fever. But it was too late to offer objection on such grounds, and my wife and I followed our chattering guides, who disposed themselves here and there on this ancient bed of hay, and insisted that we should find a place in the center of their circle. At my suggestion, the 2 farm lanterns had been left at a suitable distance, in fact, quite at the other side of the barn, and our only light came from the rapidly falling twilight of outdoors, which found its way through a little window and sundry cracks high in the eaves above the rafters. There was something about the place, now that we were settled and no longer occupied with adjustments of comfort, that subdued our spirits, and it was with much less hilarity that the young people united in demanding a story. I looked across to my wife, whose face was faintly visible within the circle. I thought that even in the half-light I glimpsed the same expression of amused incredulity which she had worn earlier in the day, when I had yielded to the importunities of a deputation of my students for the ghost story party at the eve of a holiday. Well, there is no reason, I thought to myself, repeating the phrases I had used then. There is no reason why I shouldn't tell a ghost story. True, I had never done so before, but the literary attainment which have enabled me to perfect my recent treatise upon the disuse of the comma are quite equal to impromptu experimentation in the field of psychic phenomena. Well, I was aware that the young people themselves hardly expected serious acquiescence, and that, too, well, that stimulated me. I cleared my throat in a prefatory manner, and silence fell upon the group. A light breeze had risen outside, and the timbers of the barn creaked persistently. From the shadows, almost directly overhead, there came a faint clanking. It was evidently caused by the rusty pulley wheel which I had observed there as we entered. An iron hook at the end of an ancient rope still depended from it, and it swung in the lightly stirring air several feet above our heads, directly over the center of our circle. Some curious combination of influences, perhaps the atmosphere of the place added to the stimulation of the faintly discernible faces around me, and my impulse to prove my own ability in this untried field of narration gave me a sudden sense of being inspired. I found myself voicing fancies as though they were facts, and readily including imaginary names and data which certainly were not in any way premeditated. Well, this barn stands on the old Creed place, I began. Peter Creed was its last owner, but I suppose that it has always been and always will be known as the Turner Barn. A few yards away to the south, you will find the crumbling brickwork and gaping hollow of an old foundation, now overgrown with weeds that almost conceal a few charred timbers. That is all that's left of the old Ashley Turner house. I cleared my throat again, not through any effort to gain time for my thoughts, but to feel for a moment the satisfaction arising from the intent attitude of my audience, particularly my wife, who had leaned forward and was looking at me with an expression of startled surprise. Ashley Turner must have had a pretty fine-looking farm here 30 years ago or so, when he brought his wife to it. This barn was new then, but he was a ne'er-do-well, with nothing to be said in his favor unless you admit his fame as a practical joker. Strange how the ne'er-do-well is often equipped with an extravagant sense of humor. Turner had a considerable retinue among the riff-raff boys of the neighborhood, who made this barn a noisy rendezvous and followed his hints in much whimsical mischief. But he committed most of his practical jokes when drunk and in his sober moments. He abused his family and let his wife struggle to keep up the acres, assisted only by a half-competent man of all work. Finally, he took to roving. No one knew how he got pocket money. His wife could not have given him any. Then someone discovered that he was going over to Creed's now and then, and, well, everything was explained. This concise data of mine was eventually not holding the close attention of my youthful audience. They annoyed me by frequent pranks and whisperings. No one could have been more surprised at my glibness than myself, except perhaps my wife, whose attitude of strained attention was not relaxed. I resumed my story. Peter Creed was a good old-fashioned loan shark of the worst type. Oh, he went to church regularly, one day a week, and gouged his neighbors, and any that he could get in his clutches on the other 6 days. He must have been lending Turner drinking money, and, well, everyone knew what the security must be. At last, there came a day when the long-suffering wife revolted. Turner had come home extra drunk, and in his most maudlin humor, probably he attempted some drunken prank upon his overtaxed wife. Old Ike, the hired man, said that he thought Turner had rigged up some scare for her in the barn, and that he had never heard anything so much like straight talking from his mistress, either before or since. He was working in the woodshed at the time, with the door shut. Shortly after that tirade, Ashley Turner disappeared, and no one saw or heard of him, or thought about him, for a couple of years, except when the sight of his tired-looking wife and scrawny children revived the recollection. At last, on a certain autumn day, old Peter Creed turned up here at the Turner place. Well, I imagine Miss Turner knew what it was in store for her when his rusty buggy came in sight around the corner of the barn. At any rate, she made no protest and listened meekly to his curt statement that he held an overdue mortgage with plenty of back interest owing, and it was time for her to go. She went. Neither she nor anyone else doubted Creed's rights in the matter, and after all, I believe he got a better home for her somewhere in the long run. I paused here in my narration to draw breath and readjust my leg, which had become cramped. There was a general readjustment and shifting of position with some levity. It was darker now. The rafters above us were invisible, and the faces about me looked oddly white against the shadowy background. After a moment or two of delay, I cleared my throat sharply and continued. Old Creed came thus into possession of this place, just as he had come down a dozen others in the country. He usually lived on one until he was able to sell it to a good profit over his investment. So he settled down in the Turner house and kept old Ike because he worked for little or nothing, but he seemed to have a hard time finding a purchaser. It must have been about a year later when an unexpected thing happened. Creed had come out here to the barn to lock up. He always did that himself. When he noticed something unusual about the haystack. Well, this very haystack, right here, which stood at that time about 6 feet above the barn floor. He looked closer through the dusk and saw a pair of boots. Well, he went nearer and found that they were fitted to a pair of human legs whose owner was sound asleep in the hay. Creed picked up a short stick and beat on one boot. "Get out of here," he said, "or I'll have you locked up." The sleeper woke in slow fashion, sat up, grinned, and said, "Hello, Peter Creed." It was Ashley Turner, beyond question. Creed stepped back a pace or two and seemed at a loss for words. An object slipped from Turner's pocket as he moved, sliding along the hay, and fell to the barn floor. It was a half-filled whiskey flask. No one knows the full details of the conversation that ensued, of course. Such little as I am able to tell you of what was said and done comes through old Ike, who watched from a safe distance outside the barn, ready to act at a moment's notice as best suited his own safety and welfare. Of one thing Ike was certain. Creed lacked his usual browbeating manner. He was apparently struggling to assume an unwanted friendliness, and Turner was very drunk, but triumphant, and his satisfaction over what he must have felt with the practical joke of his life seemed to make him friendly. "Oh, I kept him all right," he said again and again. "I've got the proof. I wasn't working for nothing all these months. I ain't no fool enough yet to throw any papers away, even when I'm drunk." To the watchful Ike's astonishment, Creed evidently tried to persuade him to come into the house for something to eat. Turner slid off the haystack, found his step too unsteady, laughed foolishly, and suggested that Creed bring him some food there. "Guess I've got a right to sleep in the barn or the house, whichever I want," he said, leering into Creed's face. The old loan shark stood there for a few minutes, eyeing Turner thoughtfully. Then he actually gave him a shoulder back onto the hay, said something about finding a snack of supper, and started out of the barn. In the doorway he turned, looked back, then walked over to the edge of the haystack, groped on the floor until he found the whiskey flask and picked it up and tossed it into Turner's lap and stumbled out of the barn again. I was becoming interested in my own story and somewhat pleased with the fluency of it. But my audience annoyed me. There was intermittent whispering with some laughter. I inferred that one or another would occasionally stimulate this inattention by tickling a companion with a straw. Miss Anstell, who is so frivolous by nature that I sometimes question her right to a place in my classroom, I even suspected of irritating the back of my own neck with the same fashion. Naturally, I ignored it, though. Peter Creed, I repeated, went into the house. Ike hung around the barn, waiting. He was frankly curious. In a few minutes, his employer reappeared, carrying a plate heaped with an assortment of scraps. Ike peered and listened then, without compunction. "It's the best I've got," he heard Creed say grudgingly. Turner's tones were now more drunkenly belligerent. "It had better be," he said loudly, "and I'll take the best bed after I've eaten, tonight." Evidently he was eating and muttering between mouthfuls. "You might have brought me another bottle." "Oh, I did," said Creed. To the listening Ike's great astonishment, Turner laughed immoderately. A long silence followed. Turner was either eating or drinking. Then he spoke again, more thickly and drowsily. "Damn unpleasant, that rope. Why don't you haul it up out of my way?" "It don't hurt you any," said Creed. "Don't you wish it would?" said Turner with drunken shrewdness. "But I don't like it. Haul it away. Now." Oh, I will," said Creed. There was a longer silence, and then there came an intermittent rasping sound. A moment later, Creed came suddenly from the barn. Ike fumbled with a large rake and made as though to hang it on some accustomed peg near the barn door. Creed eyed him sharply. "You get along to bed now," he ordered, and Ike obeyed. That was a Saturday night. On Sunday morning, Ike went to the barn later than usual and hesitatingly, yet he still entered. He found the drunkard's body hanging here over this haystack, just about where we are sitting, stark and cold. It was a gruesome end to a miserable homecoming. My audience was quiet enough now. Miss Anstell and one or two others giggled loudly, but it was obviously forced, and found no further echo. The breeze, which had sprung up some time before, was producing strange creakings and raspings in the old timbers, and the pulley wheel, far above us, clanked with a dismal, repetitious sound like the tolling of a cracked bell. I waited a moment, well satisfied with the effect, and then continued. The coroner's jury found it a suicide, though some shook their heads meaningly. Turner had apparently sobered up enough to stand, and making a simple loop around his neck by catching the rope around through the hook, had then slid off the haystack. The rope, which went over the pulley wheel up there on the roof, ran out through a window under the eaves over there, and was made fast near the barn door outside, where anyone could haul on it. Creed testified the knot was one that he had tied many days before. Ike was a timid old man with a wholesome fear of his employer, and he supported the testimony, and made no reference to his eavesdropping of the previous evening, though he heard Creed swear before the jury that he did not recognize the tramp he had fed and lodged. There were no papers in Turner's pockets, only a few coins, and a marked pocket knife that gave the first clue to his identity. A few of the neighbors said that it was a fitting end, and that the verdict was a just one. Nevertheless, whisperings began and increased. Well, people avoided Creed and the neighborhood. Rumors grew that the barn was haunted. Passers-by on the road after dark said they heard the old pulley wheel clanking when no breeze stirred, much as you hear it now. Some claimed to have heard maudlin laughter. Possible purchasers were frightened away, and Creed grew more and more solitary and misanthropic. Old Ike hung on, heaven knows why, though I suppose Creed paid him some sort of a wage. Rumors increased. Folks said that neither Ike nor Creed entered this barn after a time, and no hay was put in it, though Creed would not have been Creed if he had not sold off the bulk of what he had, ghost or no ghost. I can imagine him slowly forking it out alone. The amount of hay still here proves that he finally lost courage. Well, I paused a moment, but though there was much uneasy stirring about, and the dismal clanking directly above us was incessant, not one of my audience spoke. It was wholly dark now, and I think all had drawn close together. About 10 years ago, people began calling Creed crazy. Here I was forced to interrupt my own story. I shall have to ask you, Miss Anstill, to stop annoying me. I've been aware for some moments that you're brushing my head with straw, but I've ignored it for the sake of others, so knock it off. Out of the darkness came Miss Anstill's voice, protesting earnestly, and I realized from the direction of the sound that in the general readjustment she must have settled down in the very center of our circle and could not be the one at fault. One of the others was childish enough to simulate a mocking burst of raucous laughter, but I chose to ignore it. Very well, I said graciously. Shall I go on? Go on, echoed a subdued chorus. Well, it was the night of the 28th of May, 10 years ago. Not the 28th, broke in my wife's voice sharply. That's today's date. There was a note in her voice that I had hardly recognized, but it indicated that she was in some way affected by my narration, and I felt a distinct sense of triumph. It was the night of May 28th, I repeated firmly. Are you making up this story? Still with the same odd tone. Well, I am, my dear, but you keep interrupting it. But an Ashley Turner and later a Peter Creed owned this place, she persisted almost in a whisper. And I'm sure you never heard of them. Well, I confess that I might wisely have broke off my story then and called for a light. There had been an hysterical tone in my wife's voice, and I was startled at her words, for I had no conscious recollection of either name, yet I felt a resultant exhilaration. Our lanterns had grown strangely dim, though I was certain both had been recently trimmed and filled, and from their far corner of the barn, they threw no light whatever into our circle. I faced an utter blackness. Well, that night, said I, old Ike was awakened by sounds as of someone fumbling to unbar and open the house door. It was an unwonted hour, and he peered from the window of his little room. By the dim starlight, it was just before dawn, he could see all of the open yard and roadway before the house, with the great barn looming like a black and sinister shadow as its farther barrier. Crossing this space, he saw the figure of Peter Creed, grotesquely stooped and old in the obscuring gloom, moving slowly, almost gropingly, and yet directly, as though impelled toward the barn's overwhelming shadow. Slowly, he unbarred the great door and swung it open, and entered the blacker shadows concealed within, and then the door closed after him. Ike, in his secure post of observation, did not stir. He couldn't. Even to his crude imagining, there was something utterly horrible in the thought of Creed alone at that hour in just such a black darkness as this, with the great timber chamber haunted at least by its dreaded memories, if nothing else. He could only wait, tense and fearful of he knew not what. A shriek that pierced the silence relaxed his tension, bringing almost a sense of relief, so definite had been his expectancy. But it was all a burst of shrill laughter, ribald, uncanny, undeniable, accompanying the shriek that gave him the power of motion. He ran half-naked 1/4 mile to the nearest neighbors and told his story. They found Creed hanging, the rope hooked simply around his neck. It was a silent jury that filed from the barn that morning after viewing the body. Suicide, said they, after Ike, shivering and stammering, had testified, hearkening back to the untold evidence of that other morning years before. Ah, yes. Creed was dead, with a terrible look on his wizened face, and the dusty old rope ran through its pulley wheel and was fastened to a beam high above. Well, he must have climbed to the beam and made the rope fast and jumped, said the foreman of the jury solemnly. Well, he must have, repeated the man, parroting him, while the sweat stood out on his forehead. Because there's just no other way. But God is my judge, the knot in that rope and the dust on the beam ain't been disturbed for years. At this dramatic climax, there was an audible sigh from my audience. I sat quietly for a time, content to allow the silence and the atmosphere of the place, which actually seemed surcharged with influences of my creation, to add to the effect my story had caused. There was scarcely a movement in our circle. Of that I felt sure. And yet once more, out of the almost tangible darkness above me, something seemed to reach down and brush against my head. A slight motion of air, sufficient to disturb my rather scanty locks, was additional proof that I was but the butt of some prank that had just missed its objective. Then, with a fearful suddenness, close to my ear burst a shrill discourse of laughter so uncanny and so unlike the usual sound of student merriment that I started up, half wondering if I had heard it. Almost immediately after it, the heavy darkness was torn again by a shriek so terrible in its intensity as to completely to be differentiated from any other cries which followed. "Bring a light!" cried a voice that I recognized as that of my wife, though strangely distorted by emotion, and there was a great confusion. Young women struggled from their places and impeded one another in the darkness, but finally, and it seemed an unbearable delay, someone brought a single lantern. Its frail light revealed Miss Anstill, half upright from her place in the center of our circle, my wife's arms sustaining her weight. Her face, as well as I could see, seemed darkened and distorted, and When we forced her clutching hands away from her bared throat, we could see, even in that light, the marks of an angry, throttling scar entirely encircling it. Just above her head, the old pulley rope swayed menacingly in the faint breeze. My recollection is, even now, confused as to the following moments and our stumbling escape from the gruesome spot. Miss Anstell is now at her home, recovering from what her physician calls mental shock. My wife will not speak of it. The questions I would ask her are checked on my lips by the look of utter terror in her eyes. As I have confessed to you, my own philosophy is hard to put to it, to withstand not so much the community attitude toward what they are pleased to call my taste in practical joking, but to assemble and adjust the facts of my experience. If you like these stories, subscribe, like, and share. And don't forget to hit that notification bell for future stories. And as always, I thank you for taking the time to listen. The end.